We begin this morning a new series in the book of Luke. Leading up to Christmas, it's a good time because the first parts of the book of Luke deal with the Christmas story. And Christmas is filled with many traditions, isn't it? We certainly have our family traditions, we have our cultural traditions, and certainly in the world, much is made out of Christmas. You have the infamous Father Christmas. Is he real or isn't he? That's the question. I suppose that to a certain degree depends on one's age. There are endless books and films that have been written and made about Christmas. How the Grinch Stole Christmas, The Santa Claus, A Christmas Story, A Charlie Brown Christmas, A Nightmare Before Christmas. What else are people going to be thinking about? Is it all just a fairy tale? Something that's beautiful, something that excites us, but in the end is actually just simply a fantasy or a myth. And is Luke's Gospel just one of those stories? A story that's been made up, that's beautiful, that uplifts our spirits, but in the end, a story that we can put aside and ignore. Something that's not really true. Well, many people believe that. And so the Pulitzer Prize-winning novelist Edna Faber said, Christmas isn't a season, it's a feeling. That's the important thing about Christmas, is the fact that it affects your feeling, it affects your emotions. Surprisingly, the atheist Richard Dawkins has a great love of Christmas. He loves singing the Christian Christmas carols. He practices caroling and gifting. But he says he only celebrates Christmas as a kind of fiction. He does what he calls LARPing, live action role playing. And he says, I revel in the season as a way of celebrating family and friends, which really is the modern meaning of Christmas. So what Richard Dawkins does there is he says, well, what Luke writes about here in his first few chapters, was fine for people in the past, but it is no longer true for us. Christmas is merely all about emotions, about having your spirit uplifted and escape from this world that we live in. But that's certainly not the way that Luke thought about the Christmas story and thought about his gospel as a whole. And in a sense, Luke is unique amongst the writers of the gospel by stating right up front his purpose and his method of writing his gospel account. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us. Luke acknowledges that he's not the only one who's written a history, but in fact that there have been many who've drawn up and recorded the story of Jesus' birth and of Jesus' life. We don't know exactly who Luke is referring to. Certainly the Gospel of Mark would have been in existence by the time that Luke was writing. But Luke tells us that he also has decided to compose a gospel. And Luke mentions all these other attempts, not as a way of saying, well, they're not good enough, we need something more. They've left holes in their story and we need to fill out the story, but he in fact implies that he trusts the reliability of these other stories, these other records about the life of Christ. But he too wants to write an account. And he writes specifically to a man called Theophilus, But obviously he expects a wider readership than just Theophilus. Who Theophilus is, we don't really know. We can speculate, but we don't know. But as Luke is writing, he's writing about the things that have been fulfilled amongst us. In other words, he's saying, I'm not just writing down a story, a history, something that has happened. He's writing with a very specific purpose. He's writing about events that happened that have been fulfilled. In other words, somewhere along the line they've been predicted to happen. And Luke would have been looking back to the Old Testament. The Old Testament that was pointing forward to the Messiah, pointing forward to Jesus. And Luke is not just a dispassionate historian, but he's passionate about what he's writing about. But the fact that he's intimately involved in the events that happened doesn't mean that he's an inferior historian. But he writes out of a perspective of salvation history that has been fulfilled, showing that the gospel's saving purposes have been fulfilled in this man Jesus Christ, about whom he is writing. And Luke tells us that his account is comprehensive. He says, I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning. Luke was a doctor. Paul tells us in Colossians chapter 4 and verse 14, our dear friend Luke the doctor sends greetings. And probably he was a physician in Troas and was there converted under Paul's ministry when Paul came through that town. We know from the book of Acts that Luke himself accompanied Paul on his missionary journeys. And many of the passages in Paul's epistles as well as Luke writings show the extent and the accuracy of his recording. See, this was a doctor, a man who worked with facts, and a man who was careful to investigate facts. You wouldn't entrust yourself to a doctor who's just very casual. Right, sometimes we do come across doctors that don't investigate, that aren't casual, but nobody in their right mind would stay with such a doctor, would they? You come in and you're suffering with a certain disease and he just simply says, no, I don't think you've got that, I think you've got this, but does no investigation. We don't stay with doctors like that. We're going to find doctors who are concerned about the details. And Luke was such a doctor. In his investigation, he tells us that he has investigated everything from the beginning. He's gone right back to the commencement of the gospel. Unlike Mark, who starts his gospel with the public ministry of Jesus, Luke goes back to the beginning of Jesus' life. In fact, before that. And he says he's examined everything. In other words, what he is recording for us is accurate. It's not just a superficial study, but a detailed examination. He examines all the data. And as we will find as we work our way through Luke's Gospel, is that he constantly references historical detail. He constantly relates the life of Jesus to that of the Jewish and the Roman world around him. In the book of Acts, he relates the life of the first Christians to the actual world around them. He's a good doctor. So what would have been his sources? Well, he tells us there in verse 1. Verse 2, as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. Luke himself wasn't an eyewitness. Luke himself wasn't around when Jesus lived. But what Luke did is he went to those who were eyewitnesses. He went to those who were together with Jesus. And the first preachers didn't present elaborate systems of doctrine or anything. They simply related what Jesus taught and shared that. They simply spoke about the facts of what happened. They told what they had seen and what they had heard. And so John tells us in his letter in 1 John chapter 1, that which was from the beginning, which we have heard, which we have seen with our eyes, which we have looked at, and our hands have touched, this we proclaim concerning the word of life. And Luke came into contact with these apostles who were eyewitnesses, and he recorded what they said. But what about other sources? Well, obviously, Luke spent much time with Paul as they were traveling and would have heard Paul's story and Paul relating the events of Jesus. Luke spent time in the presence of Philip the evangelist. In Acts 21, we read that we reached Caesarea and stayed at the house of Philip the evangelist, one of the 7. Luke would have had Mark's gospel as a template to work from, and possibly other written accounts that have been lost. From the way that we see Luke's gospel is written, he probably had contact with Mary, because Luke records for us instances of what happens in Mary's life. Certainly he would have been familiar and had contact with people who were around at the time when John was born and when Jesus was born. And so Luke has done thorough research, and he says he wants to write an orderly account. His aim is to present an orderly written account, an account that is broadly chronological. Not all chronological. We in the modern world immediately say, well, when something is not chronological, well, there's doubt about that. But no, in the first century, people ordered their material differently. We see that in Old Testament historical books. It is not always chronological. It is sometimes ordered thematically. And that's what we will find in Luke's Gospel too. He will take one or two things out of chronological order because it fits better with what he's speaking about in his theme. But it is a well-organized account. Those are very high aims, aren't they? We have to ask the question, well, how good is Luke's account? How accurate is it? Is it trustworthy? It's fine to make these claims, but in fact, can we actually accept these claims? Well, friends, Luke recorded datable history, not myth. He takes great care that he is accurate in giving political and geographical background to the details that he records, to the events. And William Ramsay, who's an authority in the field of archaeology, he's not a theologian, he's an archaeologist, states this about Luke, both about Luke's Gospel and the book of Acts. He says, Luke's history is unsurpassed in respect of trustworthiness. Luke is a historian of first rank. Not merely are his statements of fact trustworthy, he is possessed of the true historic sense. He seizes the important and the critical events and shows their true nature at greater length, while he touches lightly or omits entirely much of that which is valueless for his purpose. In short, this author should be placed alongside the very greatest of historians. And we find that as we read Luke's Gospel, as we read the book of Acts, also written by Luke, that where he touches on historical fact, he is in fact very, very accurate. So why does Luke write? Well, Luke tells us that in verse 4, doesn't he? He says, so that you may know the certainty of the things that you have been taught. Theophilus, I'm writing this to you so that you will be certain about the things that you've been taught, that you'll be convinced of its reliability, on the matters of which you've been instructed, that you will learn the truth with full certainty. See, Luke's desire for Theophilus primarily, but for all Luke's readers, and that includes us, is that our faith will rest on firm ground, that there will be a solid foundation beneath our feet, that we will grasp the truthfulness, the veracity of the gospel narrative. Luke's aim is that we will be sure of our faith in Jesus. See, friends, this is what sets the Christian faith aside and apart from every other faith. Christianity is rooted in historical fact. Yes, Islam, Muhammad was a historical person. He lived around about AD 600. But what makes Islam different to Christianity is that Islam was invented by a historical person called Muhammad. But the actual teaching of Islam is not related to history, except where Islam has embraced the biblical facts, and then a lot of those are distorted. But Christianity, you cannot separate from history. You cannot separate it from a historical Jesus and what he taught in history. And it's the only faith where that is true. Every other faith exists because of the creativity of some other human being. And so Christianity is not a collection of legends. It's not based on human speculation. It's not a theory. It's not what somebody thought, well, this would make a good religion and let's set this up. It's not a philosophy. It is based on historical facts. See, and that is what Luke is telling us here. I've investigated the facts. I've spoken to eyewitnesses. I've spoken to those who were around. I've made a careful record of everything that they say, and here is an orderly account so that you can be certain of your faith, that you can rest your faith on these things. Because, friends, it's not important to have faith. Every human being has faith. It is important, vitally important, crucially important, that we have a true faith. Because sadly, so many people have a sincere, devout faith who at the end of their lives will find out that they believed in something that wasn't true. And that's very sad, isn't it? To devote your whole life to something, to devote your energy, your talents, your resources to something, only to find out it's not true. We need a true faith. And Luke says, I'm giving you an orderly account of things as they were, things as they really happened, so that you know you have a true faith. See, friends, Luke's gospel places us at the point of decision, doesn't it? So often people say, well, you can have your faith and I can have my faith. And that's fine. But if people say that, we can't both be right. Either one of us is wrong, or both of us are wrong. But conflicting truth claims, conflicting faith claims cannot both be right. And Luke is saying the Christian faith is based on solid, objective, historical fact. It is trustworthy and it is dependable. And that places us in a decision. You see, we can either reject it, but then we need to be very certain why we reject it, or we have to accept it. The option that Jesus was a good man, Jesus was a good teacher, is not available to us because of the claims that Jesus makes. So the question this morning to you is, what do you rest your faith on? What is the foundation? Do you have a certain foundation? There is only one certain foundation, and that is Jesus. And Luke is going to tell us who this Jesus is and what he did for you and for me. And we are called to respond in faith, so that you may know the certainty, that you may have a certain faith, that you won't have doubts, but that you will accept Jesus as Lord and Savior for yourself.